She was meticulous. Every morning at exactly 6:30, Rebecca Langston brewed her single cup of coffee, walked barefoot across the cold kitchen floor, and stood by the window overlooking her garden as the sun pushed its way through the clouds. Her planner, always color-coded, sat open on the counter. Appointments. Deadlines. Baby names, circled in soft pink. She believed in structure. In intention. In the kind of discipline that builds a life from the ground up, even when your body keeps telling you it won't cooperate. Rebecca was 36. A teacher. A sister. A woman with a quiet strength that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. She'd been trying to get pregnant for 5 years. And she was close. The embryos, hers and her husband's, were frozen and preserved just 2 miles away at the clinic where her husband worked. 3 perfect chances. She called them our snowflakes. Her husband, Dr. Thomas Langston, was a fertility specialist. Charismatic. Highly respected. The kind of man people trusted without hesitation. His name sat on the front door of the clinic. His smile appeared in brochures beside newborns wrapped in hospital blankets. Patients described him as compassionate. His staff called him Doc L. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and always sent flowers. And when people looked at him with admiration, he accepted it like it was simply the air he breathed. Their marriage, by all accounts, was strong. They hosted barbecues in the summer, wore matching costumes at Halloween, volunteered on weekends. At church, they sat in the third pew, always holding hands. Their refrigerator was covered in photos, vacations, family, sonogram printouts. From the outside, there were no cracks. No missteps. No hesitation. Until March 17th. That morning, Rebecca missed her staff meeting. No one heard from her. No texts. No calls. No update in the group chat. Her coworker tried to reach her 3 times. No answer. By noon, her phone was going straight to voicemail. At 6:42 p.m., Thomas called 911. He told the operator his wife hadn't come home. That it wasn't like her. That he was worried something had happened. Police were dispatched to their home within 20 minutes. The door was unlocked. The coffee mug was still half full on the kitchen counter. The dishwasher was running. Her planner hadn't moved. Her phone was on the nightstand. Her car was in the garage. It was as if she had vanished into thin air in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. But disappearances are never ordinary. They don't follow clean timelines or give easy answers. They raise questions that don't come with instructions. Where did she go? Why did she leave her phone? Why was her wedding ring still in the jewelry dish by the sink? And why wasn't Thomas asking those same questions? He didn't cry. He didn't pace. He told police she was probably just upset. That maybe she needed space. That she'd done this before. But her sister disagreed. Rebecca had never just left. She made lists. She followed routines. She planned every hour of her day. If she was upset, she would have written about it. If she was scared, she would have told someone. Within 24 hours, Rebecca Langston was listed as a missing person. Within 72, her entire life unraveled. Because what no one knew, not her friends, not her family, not even Rebecca herself, was that Thomas Langston had been living another life. One that started long before that spring morning. One that didn't include his wife. And every piece of it was deliberate. Every smile. Every word. Every late night at the clinic. There are moments in a case that you can point to and say, that was the beginning of the end. For Rebecca Langston, it began the day she told her husband she wanted full custody of the embryos. The same day she wrote the sentence in her journal, "I don't think I know who he is anymore." You're watching the story of a woman who trusted the wrong person. And a man who believed that creating life gave him the right to destroy one. This is the case of Rebecca Langston. And it begins with a lie so quiet, it almost went unnoticed. March in Hamilton, Ontario, is cold in a way that seeps into your bones. The snow lingers, even when it turns gray. The wind finds its way through every crack in the windows. And yet, inside the Langston home, things always looked warm. Beige walls. White trim. The kind of house that belonged in a real estate magazine. Spotless kitchen. Throw blankets folded just so. A scented candle burning quietly by the sink. It gave the illusion that nothing bad could ever happen there. Rebecca Langston had lived in that house for 8 years. She picked it out herself after falling in love with the wraparound porch and the clawfoot tub. She said she could picture raising a family there. Teaching her children how to ride bikes down the cul-de-sac. Setting up a lemonade stand in the summer. Decorating the stairs at Christmas. She was born just 30 minutes away, in Burlington. The youngest of 3 girls. Her mother was a nurse. Her father worked in transit. They weren't wealthy, but they were close. Rebecca was the quiet one. Always reading. Always thinking. She kept her room neat, her notebooks neater. She dreamed about being a teacher from the time she was 9. By the time she met Thomas, she was already teaching 4th grade and saving for a down payment. They met at a fundraising gala for children's health research. Rebecca had only gone because a friend insisted. Thomas was speaking on behalf of his clinic. He was magnetic. Smart without being arrogant. Polished. And he watched her with such interest, like everything she said mattered. They went out for coffee the next morning. By the 3rd date, he told her he could see their future together. 6 months later, he proposed. Friends said they were perfect for each other, both driven, both successful, both ready to settle down. The wedding was held on the lakefront. White roses. A string quartet. Thomas cried during the vows. Rebecca's mother said she had never seen her daughter so radiant. But what people didn't see was that something changed after the wedding. Thomas started working longer hours. At first, it was excusable. He was growing the clinic. Taking on more patients. But soon, he stopped answering texts. Missed dinner plans. Showed up late to family events with vague excuses. Still, Rebecca remained patient. She chalked it up to stress. To ambition. She believed in their future, especially the one they were planning together. That future was frozen in a nitrogen tank in the lab at his clinic. 5 attempts at IVF. 2 miscarriages. 1 devastating diagnosis that Rebecca would never carry to term. Her body had become the battleground of her dreams. Hormones. Injections. Ultrasounds. Hope, followed by crushing disappointment. And still, she persisted. Every cycle. Every appointment. Every setback. And through it all, Thomas became more distant. She would ask him to come to appointments. Sometimes he showed. Sometimes he didn't. He would say he had to stay late. That emergencies came up. That other women, strangers, needed him more than she did. And she would nod, and smile, and pretend that made sense. Until she found the receipts. 2 dinners at the same Italian restaurant. Both on nights he said he was working. Both charged to the joint account. Both for 2 people. Then there were the text messages. A phone left unlocked. A name she didn't recognize. Words she couldn't unsee. She didn't confront him immediately. That wasn't her style. Instead, she started documenting everything. She kept a journal, something she hadn't done since high school. Each entry logged with dates, times, suspicions, feelings she couldn't voice out loud. She became her own investigator, looking for the moment when her marriage had stopped being real. That moment came on February 10th. In her journal, she wrote, "He doesn't look at me the same. I think he's in love with someone else. But he still wants the embryos." Why? Because Thomas wasn't just cheating. He was planning a future with someone else. Someone younger. Someone who couldn't have children either. And in his mind, those frozen embryos weren't just hope. They were leverage. They were legacy. They were his property. Rebecca had filed a petition, quietly, to assume full control over the embryos. She hadn't told him yet. She wanted to wait until the paperwork was finalized. She was afraid of how he might react. She told her sister over the phone, whispering in the hallway, "If anything happens to me, don't let him get them." That was 3 weeks before she disappeared. And it changed everything. Because up until then, she thought she was in control. She thought documenting it all would protect her. She didn't know that Thomas had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let her win. Not in court. Not in life. Not at all. The investigation into her disappearance would uncover layers of deceit, bank transfers, burner phones, lies so rehearsed they could have been scripted. And at the center of it, a man who had convinced the world he only wanted to help people build families. But the truth is, Thomas Langston didn't want to build one. He wanted to steal one. And he was willing to kill to get it. The morning Rebecca didn't show up for work, her co-workers assumed she was sick. It was a Monday. She was never late. Never missed a lesson plan. Never left her students hanging. But no one panicked right away. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she was sleeping off a cold. Maybe she just needed a day to herself. But by 10 a.m., when the school secretary still hadn't heard from her, they started calling. First her cell. Then her home. Then her emergency contact. Thomas picked up on the third ring. He sounded confused, almost annoyed. He said she left early that morning, same as always. Said maybe she stopped for coffee. Said maybe she needed some air. Then he promised he'd check in and get back to them. But he never called the school again. Rebecca's sister, Caroline, was the one who finally drove over to the house. The porch light was still on, even though it was nearly noon. The front door was locked. No answer when she knocked. She tried calling. Straight to voicemail. Caroline still had a spare key from when Rebecca had her appendix removed 2 years prior. She let herself in and started calling her name. No sound. The coffee machine was still warm. A half-eaten piece of toast sat on a plate beside the sink. Her handbag was gone, but her car keys were still on the counter. That's when Caroline called the police. When the officers arrived, there was no sign of forced entry. No signs of struggle. No blood. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. But her phone charger was still plugged into the wall beside the bed, and her favorite sweater, one she wore almost every day, was draped over the back of the living room chair. It didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. The responding officer noted something else. The security camera at the front door, the one Rebecca told her sister she'd installed after a neighbor's car was broken into, had been disabled. The footage had been wiped. The hard drive, removed. The official report listed her as a missing person. No known enemies. No mental health concerns. No recent arguments with friends or family. No reasons to vanish. But when detectives began asking questions, they started hearing a different version of her life. One told them about the fertility treatments. Another mentioned the miscarriages. A coworker confided that Rebecca had been off the past few weeks, distracted, nervous, like something was weighing on her. Then they spoke to her lawyer. Rebecca had filed a request for sole custodianship of the remaining embryos. The paperwork was timestamped just 12 days before she disappeared. Thomas claimed he had no idea. But there was a catch. His alibi didn't hold. He told investigators he was seeing a patient at the time of her disappearance. That he left the clinic around 9 a.m. and had been in back-to-back consultations all morning. But the receptionist said he wasn't in that day. The clinic's digital log showed no activity on his ID badge between 8:42 a.m. and 12:06 p.m. And when detectives pulled traffic camera footage, they spotted his black BMW pulling off Highway 403, heading toward a remote stretch of forest preserve just outside Hamilton. The area was rarely patrolled. Densely wooded. The kind of place where people went to dump garbage, or secrets. The same place Thomas had taken Rebecca hiking 6 years earlier when he proposed. Detectives searched the area for 2 days. They found nothing at first. Then a volunteer from a nearby trail running group reported an unusual patch of disturbed soil. They brought in the dogs. The cadaver team. The crime scene unit. It didn't take long after that. The hole was shallow. Maybe 2 feet deep. The soil loose and uneven. And inside, wrapped in a tarp, weighted down with cinder blocks, was the body of Rebecca Langston. She was still wearing her pajamas. The autopsy report confirmed what detectives already feared. She had been suffocated. No bruising. No blunt force trauma. No defensive wounds. Just a single piece of fabric, likely a pillowcase or a towel, used to press down over her face until the oxygen stopped. The pathologist estimated her time of death to be within a 3-hour window on the morning of her disappearance. Which put Thomas exactly where they thought he'd been. But the motive still wasn't airtight. It would be the bank statements that unraveled everything. Over the span of 4 months, Thomas had made 5 wire transfers from their joint savings account to a private fertility clinic in Prague. Each transfer was just under $10,000. The recipient? A woman named Nadia Sykorova. She was 31. Slovakian-born. A former patient at Thomas's clinic in Toronto. She'd been denied further treatment due to lack of funds, and the fact that she was in a relationship with Thomas Langston, the director of the clinic. A relationship he never disclosed to his board. Or to his wife. When police brought her in for questioning, Nadia folded in less than 2 hours. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't deny the affair. She didn't even try to justify the money. She said Thomas had promised her a baby. Promised her they'd be a family. Said his marriage was a technicality. That his wife was holding his children hostage. That she didn't deserve them. What she didn't know was that Thomas had already booked her first implantation appointment. Using Rebecca's embryos. The appointment was scheduled for the following month. But by then, Thomas Langston would be sitting in a holding cell awaiting trial. And the embryos? They'd been placed under court protection. Locked away. Evidence of a love story gone brutally, irrevocably wrong. And proof that even the most delicate dreams, family, children, legacy, can be twisted into instruments of obsession, manipulation, and control. The full scope of Thomas's plan wouldn't come out until the trial. But the warning signs? They'd been there for years. Only no one had thought to look. It began unraveling on the stand. Day 5 of the trial. The courtroom was silent, packed. Every seat filled. Reporters lined the back wall, typing furiously. Rebecca's parents sat side by side, holding hands, her mother clutching a worn photo of their daughter in her graduation gown. Thomas sat stone-faced, flanked by his defense team. He wore the same blue suit he'd worn to his wedding. The prosecution started slow. They walked the jury through the financials, wire transfers, flagged accounts, the fertility payments made in Rebecca's name without her consent. But the turning point wasn't the money. It was the journal. The one discovered in a locked drawer at the back of Rebecca's closet, hidden beneath a shoebox of old Christmas cards. Small, leather-bound, with a gold clasp. It had gone unnoticed during the initial search of her home. A second sweep, conducted weeks later by the Cold Case Division, turned it up during a recataloguing of her personal effects. It wasn't dramatic. No final confession. No cryptic entries. Just a painfully detailed account of a woman documenting the slow erosion of her marriage. It began nearly 3 years earlier. Just after their second failed round of IVF. Rebecca wrote about the pressure. About Thomas growing distant. About the nights he didn't come home until after midnight. She described feeling small. Unseen. Like a vessel rather than a wife. There were mentions of late-night phone calls. Password changes. Locked drawers. Whispers behind closed doors. But then, on one page, dated exactly 9 months before her murder, there it was. I found a text on his second phone. He didn't know I saw. It was from a woman named Nadia. She called him, my love. She said she couldn't wait to start a family together. She thanked him for the clinic payment. Said she was already looking at baby names. The jury hung on every word. The prosecution entered the journal into evidence. The court-appointed handwriting analyst verified the entries. The timestamps matched her calendar, her receipts, her personal emails. And then came the witness. Nadia Sykorova was brought in under subpoena. She entered the courtroom quietly, her posture stiff. When she took the stand, she looked directly at the prosecutor, never once glancing at Thomas. She admitted everything. They had met during one of her fertility consultations. He was charming. He offered extra sessions off the books. Told her he could accelerate the process. Said he had influence, that he could make the rules bend. And when she ran out of money, he offered to pay. At first, she thought it was kindness. Then it became something else. He said we were meant to have children, she said. That his wife didn't believe in him. That she only wanted the embryos to punish him. He said he loved me. He promised me a life. The courtroom was silent. Then the prosecutor asked the question no one was ready for. Did he ever mention harming Rebecca? Nadia hesitated. Swallowed. Her voice broke. He said, he wished she would just disappear. That if she were gone, everything would fall into place. I thought it was just anger. I didn't think he meant it. Then she reached into her purse and handed the prosecution team her phone. Inside was a voice message from Thomas. Sent 3 days before Rebecca vanished. In it, he spoke in a low, calm voice. Too calm. I handled it. We won't have to fight her anymore. Everything we wanted, it's finally going to happen. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Rebecca's father stood up and left the room. The defense scrambled. They claimed the recording was taken out of context. That handled it could have meant the legal paperwork. That there was no mention of violence. No admission of murder. But then the prosecution dropped the final blow. A deleted video file, recovered from the hidden drive inside Thomas's office desktop. One that IT forensics had almost missed. The footage, timestamped 5:13 a.m. on the morning of Rebecca's disappearance, showed Thomas loading a tarp and 2 cinder blocks into the trunk of his BMW. He was wearing gloves. His sleeves rolled up. Calm. Focused. Then he walked back into the garage. And 2 minutes later, Rebecca followed him in. She never came back out. There was no struggle on camera. No scream. Just a long pause. And then, Thomas returned to the frame, alone. When the jury was shown the footage, several members turned away. One woman wept openly. The judge called for a brief recess. But it was over. Every remaining doubt, every lingering thread of innocence he clung to, disintegrated on that screen. Thomas Langston was no longer a grieving husband. No longer a respected fertility specialist. No longer the man who appeared on magazine covers as a pioneer in reproductive care. He was a killer. One who traded the life of his wife for a fantasy. One who believed he could engineer a future on his own terms, with another woman, using the frozen embryos of the woman he murdered. The turn in the case was more than just evidence. It was betrayal. Calculated. Chilling. And it unfolded in layers so slow, so quiet, even the people closest to him never saw it coming. Rebecca's life ended in silence. But her words, her journal, her documentation of a love unraveling in real time, that's what brought the truth into the light. And in the end, it was her voice that told the story he tried to erase. The jury deliberated for just under 7 hours. When they returned, the courtroom stood still. No one breathed. No one moved. The foreperson held the verdict sheet in shaking hands. Guilty. First-degree murder. Fraud. Tampering with medical records. Unauthorized use of reproductive materials. The list was long, and it was damning. Thomas Langston showed no emotion. No flicker of recognition. No plea for mercy. Just a man who watched the world fold in around him, piece by piece. Rebecca's parents clung to one another as the verdict was read. Her mother sobbed into her husband's shoulder. Her father stared ahead, expression locked between devastation and relief. The sentencing came weeks later. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But justice, while final on paper, left behind a trail of pain that no verdict could erase. Rebecca's embryos, her last hope of motherhood, were sealed in legal limbo. The court ruled they could not be used, transferred, or destroyed without her explicit, written consent. And that consent, of course, would never come. The embryos remained frozen. A haunting, clinical pause in a life that had been stolen. Nadia Sakharova disappeared from the public eye shortly after the trial. She moved back to Prague, according to court records, and changed her name. She never spoke to the press again. In her final statement to the court, she said only one thing. I believed in a man who used me to erase someone else. I will never forgive him. And I will never forget her. The clinic where Thomas once worked, once praised as one of the country's most advanced fertility centers, was shut down after a full-scale investigation uncovered years of ethical violations. Several staff members were stripped of their medical licenses. Confidential patient records were found mishandled, and in one case, embryos had been fertilized using the wrong donor's sperm. Trust, in a place that once promised miracles, shattered like glass. Rebecca's story sparked national outrage. She wasn't just a victim of domestic violence. She was a woman whose body had been commodified, whose motherhood had been weaponized, whose voice had been ignored until she was gone. Her story reached Congress. Legislation was proposed to regulate the ownership and consent laws surrounding stored embryos. Debates erupted across the country. Who owns life before it begins? What rights does a woman have over her reproductive materials after death? Laws were slow to follow. But the conversation, Rebecca's conversation, had started. Her family established a foundation in her name, the Rebecca Langston Initiative. It provides legal support for women in abusive relationships, with a special focus on reproductive coercion, a term many had never even heard before her case came to light. They also fund therapy and medical services for survivors navigating trauma inside the healthcare system. Women who, like Rebecca, were told to keep quiet. To be patient. To trust a system that, in her case, had failed her catastrophically. The media frenzy died down. True crime podcasts covered the story. Documentaries followed. But for those who loved her, the real story wasn't about the murder. It was about everything that came before it. The kindness in her laugh. The stubbornness in her convictions. The way she fought for the life she wanted, even when the man beside her had already decided she didn't deserve it. Her wedding ring was returned to her mother after the trial. It had been found in the bottom drawer of Thomas's desk, next to a vial of hormones and a fertility chart marked with future dates. She was never meant to vanish. She was meant to be erased quietly, replaced, rewritten. But she left a trail. In journals. In phone calls. In receipts and clinic forms. She left behind proof that she had lived. And that she had known, deep down, that something was wrong. Rebecca's story ends in silence. But what follows is louder than Thomas Langston ever imagined. She became a cautionary tale. A call to action. A face that stared back from screens in courtrooms and classrooms. And though she would never hold the child she fought so hard for, her legacy now protects thousands of women. Women who might not have had a voice, if she hadn't insisted on using hers, even in the quiet margins of a journal she never expected anyone to read. This wasn't just a case about murder. It was about possession. About obsession. About the way control can wear the mask of love. And it was about what happens when the world finally listens, to a woman who was speaking the whole time. Rebecca Langston's case didn't just end in a courtroom. It echoed outward, pressing itself into law books, medical ethics debates, and family counseling sessions across the country. The true gravity of what happened, what was nearly overlooked, only became clear once the dust of the trial had settled, once the headlines faded and the world went back to scrolling. But some wounds don't fade quietly. In the months after the sentencing, Rebecca's story became a reference point, used in criminal justice lectures, bioethics panels, and women's rights advocacy groups. Her name was no longer just tied to tragedy, it was tied to reform. Legal scholars dissected the loopholes that allowed Thomas Langston to access and manipulate her reproductive data. Politicians referenced her case when pushing for stronger domestic violence protections that extended beyond physical abuse, protections that addressed coercion, surveillance, digital stalking, and control over reproductive autonomy. Rebecca's parents continued to appear at advocacy events, holding framed photos of their daughter. Her mother always spoke softly, but with a steadiness that cut through any room she stood in. Her father never said much, but when he did, it always began with the same words, "My daughter deserved to grow old." One of the largest impacts came in the medical community. New nationwide regulations were introduced on embryo storage and access. Clinics were required to obtain dual consent at every stage of IVF storage and use. Audit systems were put in place. Whistleblower protections were expanded. And for the first time in history, a federal database was created to track unauthorized access to reproductive materials, a grim but necessary system born from a single woman's stolen future. At Columbia University, where Rebecca had once studied, a scholarship was created in her name. It supported students pursuing careers in women's health law and reproductive justice. The first recipient was a young woman who had grown up in a shelter with her mother, fleeing domestic abuse. She said, in her acceptance speech, "Rebecca's story taught me that the law should never wait for tragedy to act." The embryo debate didn't go away. In fact, it grew louder. Bioethicists argued over the legal definition of reproductive ownership. Who has the right to life before it exists? What happens when love turns manipulative, when parenthood becomes a tool of obsession, rather than a gift of partnership? Protests formed in front of fertility clinics. Women carried signs with Rebecca's face. Her story had struck a nerve. It forced the nation to reckon with uncomfortable questions about autonomy, control, and what it means when someone weaponizes science to destroy instead of create. Years later, an investigative journalist uncovered emails Thomas had deleted, recovered from cloud archives after a years-long digital forensic battle. In those messages, written to Nadia months before the murder, Thomas laid out a plan to leave Rebecca, claim mental instability, and fight for full rights to the embryos. He wrote, "They're mine as much as hers. She doesn't get to take that from me." He'd been planning all along. The murder wasn't a crime of passion. It was a strategy. And that revelation changed everything, again. Thomas was charged with additional counts of conspiracy and manipulation of digital evidence. It didn't change his sentence, but it added weight to the legacy of the case. It added depth to the danger. It proved what so many survivors already knew: control doesn't always come with a bruise. Sometimes it comes with a login, a medical file, a smile at the right time, a touch that doesn't leave marks, but leaves damage all the same. Rebecca's Law, as it came to be known in several states, mandated psychological assessments for fertility patients flagged for patterns of coercion or medical misuse. It wasn't perfect. No law ever is. But it was a start. A line in the sand. A reminder that consent is not a formality, it is a right. The final words of this story don't come from Thomas Langston. He remains in prison, silent, mostly forgotten. No memoir. No public statements. Just a man whose need to control left him alone in a cell while the world kept moving forward without him. The last word belongs to Rebecca. In one of the final pages of her journal, found in her office drawer beneath layers of legal briefs and clinic brochures, she wrote a single sentence, underlined twice. No one should ever have to fight this hard just to keep what's already theirs. She meant her body, her choices, her future. And in telling her story, in hearing her voice through the lines she left behind, millions listened. And that is how she survived. What do you believe justice really looks like when the victim is gone, and the system learns too late? Do you think Thomas Langston's sentence was enough for what he took, from Rebecca, from her family, from the future she spent years building? Or should a crime that leaves no visible wounds but rewrites the course of someone's life carry a different kind of penalty? And what about Nadia? Do you believe she was just another manipulated player in his game, or did she know more than she let on? Rebecca's case was rare, but only in how far it went. The signs, the manipulation, the quiet isolation, the digital overreach, those happen every day. In marriages. In doctors' offices. In homes where the danger doesn't always scream, it whispers. Do you think we're doing enough to protect people from this kind of control? We want to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your theories, your feelings. Share your perspective, especially if you've seen shadows of this story in real life. Was there something that stood out to you? A detail you can't stop thinking about? And if this story moved you, don't let it disappear into the algorithm. Hit the like button. Share it. Let others know that Rebecca Langston's name deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a warning, and as a voice that couldn't be silenced. Make sure you're subscribed. We have more stories coming, real cases with real consequences, that the headlines barely scratched. Stories about justice delayed, truth hidden, and lives forever changed. Because the truth. Sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed in the dark. They happen in plain sight, under the illusion of love. We'll see you in the next case.